Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to Statistical Seminar. It's my greatest pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Jacob from USC, University of Southern California. Thank you. So Jacob is currently an associate professor at the Marshall School of Business, and he's also the Dean's associate professor. And he's working on a lot of exciting topics combining statistical machine learning and optimization. And because of his great work, he has actually received numerous awards from NSF and NIH, including the NSF Career Award. And today, Jacob is going to talk about tree-based aggregation method in statistical learning. So let's welcome Jacob.
All right, thank you so much, Enchi, and thank you all. This has been really fun. This is my first in-person seminar in ages, so it's great to be back. And I guess, Yenchi, you could let me know if anybody on Zoom has a question in case I don't notice it. Great. So yeah, normally when I give seminars, I tend to focus on one specific thing that I've done. And I'm going to try something a little different here, which is there've been a series of things I've worked on that all revolve around a particular theme that I find pretty interesting. And so basically that's what I'm going to talk about today is sort of a broader theme. And I promise I will get more specific later on, but it's going to start fairly broad. And so what is that theme? Well, the theme is what I'll call like high resolution data. And you know, at first, high resolution data seems like a purely good thing. You know, the benefits of having data at high resolution are kind of obvious, which is, you know, if you can measure something at high resolution, then you know you have the possibility of understanding it at a very fine resolution, maybe some mechanism that only sort of is visible at that finer resolution. And so it promises to, you know, allow you this like richer description of what's going on. But it's not all good. And there's sort of this interesting trade-off here, because on the other hand, when you have higher resolution data, there are these challenges. And so what sorts of challenges? Well, for one thing, you've measured more things. So you have sort of like this high dimensionality problem. But of course, you know, in statistics, we're happy with we've spent decades being happy about high dimensional things. But furthermore, sort of the nature of the measurements are also a little different, because like if you're really zoomed in enough, maybe like the quality of these features is less good. And so I'll be giving an example of that, but in particular, you can just think about like if you're measuring the number of times some event occurs, if you've defined that event to be specific enough, then maybe you'll find that it rarely occurs. And now you're dealing with a feature that's actually quite difficult to say anything about statistically. And so in practice, what you find, it sort of seems a little ironic, but like and I see this in multiple areas, different fields, people measure really high resolution data, but then they end up aggregating it to a lower resolution thing, because then they can just apply the statistical method that will work. And so it kind of feels like missing out on a lot. So it's an interesting challenge for us statisticians, because then there's sort of this question of like, what is the right level of resolution to be doing a data analysis? And I think we can think about this question, you know, in a different way, which is like, well, maybe there isn't just a single right level of resolution. Maybe one would hope to do something more adaptive, where one might zoom in certain parts, but zoom out for other parts. And certainly this question would have to deal a lot with the particular problem, the context you're working in. And so anyway, this is sort of the broad theme that I want to talk about. And to talk about it, it's useful to think about trees, basically, because you know the structure of trees is a very useful way to think about this data resolution problem. And also when you start like looking around, you see trees everywhere. Sure, Amy Willis over there would agree. So just to be concrete, to give an example, you know, and again, of this like high resolution data, you know, if you're an economist, maybe you used to only do things at a very macro level, but now you could imagine data sets where you have information about every single business in an area, and it's exciting to think that you could somehow use all that sort of very detailed level information and then sort of combine it all to say something about what's going on in an economy. So for example, like if we're in Seattle, we might look at the local bakeries, and we know, like, so for each one of these, imagine we had like sales data or something on these individual bakeries, but we know that all of these bakeries are actually, you know, just part of just one sort of subsector of business in general in Seattle, right? So these are all like in the category of retail bakeries, you could say, but retail bakeries are really just one subdivision of this larger, you know, bread and bakery product manufacturing, which in itself is a subcategory of bakeries and tortilla manufacturing. And even that, you know, that's just a particular type of food manufacturing, you know, not totally different from like dairy product manufacturing. And food manufacturing is only one aspect of the economy, of course, right? There's a lot of other kinds of manufacturing. For example, machinery manufacturing, or wood product manufacturing, and so on. And who says, you know, why stop at manufacturing? There are, of course, a lot of different other kinds of businesses like construction and finance and insurance and so on. Okay, so and this, by the way, what I've been showing right now is the, well, okay, I'm sorry that the top part of the screen is showing zoom there, but it's the North American industry classification system, which is a particular hierarchy of businesses. So if we're studying an economy, well, maybe we want to zoom in or zoom out in that way. And maybe one of the most famous examples of hierarchies comes from like ecology, where we have, you know, we're all familiar with like the taxonomies that, you know, start at kingdoms and work their way down to species or even lower. And so we can sort of have these examples in mind when we think about this tree structured data. And so in this talk, I basically have three aspects I want to talk about. The first will be in the context of regression. And again, it's this question, in each case, it's going to be this question of how to do this data adaptive aggregation, where we want to sort of, within the context of a specific problem, decide how zoomed in or zoomed out to be, but simultaneously allow for different parts to be zoomed in, you know, differential zooming based on the problem. So we'll start with a regression context, then move on to a graphical modeling situation. And then finally, I'll talk briefly about the question sort of from more of a multiple testing perspective. If you're doing this aggregation process, you know, at some point it seems like we might aggregate too much or too little. And so how can we give a sense of how we're doing? Something kind of like the false discovery rate, but for aggregation, which we will call it the false split rate. How many times did you split something up where you should have left it aggregated, essentially? Okay, so that's sort of the overview. And so to start with, we're going to talk about regression. And this is actually work with my former PhD student, Xiaohan Yan. And that's the paper that I'll be talking about. Xiaohan was at Cornell with me, along with Giles Hooker, who's in the audience, just happens to be in town. So Xiaohan is actually now at Microsoft. Right, so what were we looking at? We were actually looking at hotel reviews, for example, from TripAdvisor. And, you know, we're all experts in reading a brief paragraph of text and deciding how good or bad it is about the particular hotel we're considering. And one interesting aspect that we notice here is that, as we're highlighting here, is there are these words, these adjectives that are actually sometimes quite rarely occurring in a given data set, like the word dazzled. And yet they are very informative. because if somebody was dazzled by their hotel, that's a very good thing. And yet you could think that it could be hard for any algorithm statistical procedure to decide that dazzled is actually a positive word. So a little bit about the data set we're looking at. So these TripAdvisor reviews were actually scraped by some researchers in 2010. It was a 1 month period. And sorry, it's blocked on the slide, but basically there are about 200,000 reviews. Yes. Yeah, that's a great idea. Let me do that. Thank you. I have to figure out where the mouse is. Oh yeah, there it is. Oh, I didn't know that. Hide floating man controls. Oh, great. I'm new to Zoom. I haven't been using it for 2 years nonstop. So, all right. Thank you all. Great. Yeah. So there were about 200,000 reviews with each review being the text has some ratings, like 1 through 5 scale. And so we are just going to extract our about 7,500 distinct adjectives, and we'll think about this as a prediction problem to predict the rating, the number of stars based on the text. And our primary interest in this problem, though, is this issue of rare words. And the interesting thing is, if here we're looking at how frequently occurring are the words in this data set. And actually, what we find is that more than 90% of the adjectives appear in fewer than 0.5% of the reviews. So it's actually very common for a word to be rare. So the point is, this isn't some kind of edge case. It's actually true of many of the words that are in the data set. And so we'll call this the rare feature problem, where by rare feature, what we mean is it's a feature that's counting how many times some event occurs where that event is rare. And so if you picture like your data matrix X that you'll use in regression, it's a matrix that has a lot of zeros in it, so it's sparse. And in statistics, traditionally, we are very happy with sparsity because but that's because we talk about sparsity in the parameters that we're trying to estimate, which makes the problem easier. But here, it's sparsity in the data, which actually makes things harder because it means we have sort of less information. So a common thing in working with text data would be actually just to remove the terms that are rarely occurring, and like there's an R function that explicitly does that. What I'll make a point in a few slides, which is that sometimes even if you don't explicitly remove rare words, certain procedures like the lasso might effectively like never be able to select them. So whether this is explicit or not is almost not so important in practice. So our message here is, okay, it's wasteful to just throw out these rare terms because first of all, there are a lot of them, and second of all, they could be quite important. Like just think about the word dazzled. Clearly, that has a lot of information about the review. It's not unimportant. The challenge is just that we have very few examples of it, and that makes it hard for a statistical procedure to realize that that's an important word. And just to point out that this is not just a text problem. I mean, it's a ubiquitous problem. And so another example is microbiome data. And just a very brief description: microbes are everywhere. And it's an exciting area because it's thought that they're also very relevant either to human health or to any environment. And I enjoy this paper, which to me, the funny thing about this paper is it was stating that that the estimate, how many of these microbes are in your gut, that was overstated. And so they were revising down the number to only about 10 to the 13. Which to me is still large enough. So I've been working with some oceanographers, and oceanographers like to study the microbiome of different sites in the ocean and try to understand that variability. And if we're thinking about this problem, we could formulate certain prediction problems where we want to predict something, for example, like the chlorophyll concentration as a function of the the relative proportion of different microbes living in a given location. And in such data sets, the interesting thing is you see the same kind of thing that we saw in the text data. So this is saying like how common are these different microbe types across in a given data set. And so in this case, like 30% of these microbe types occurred in only a single sample in this data set. So it's similar like to the rare words problem, where you think like, well, how could I possibly know something about a microbe if it only occurred one time in my data set? Okay, so obviously this is a very big field, so people do a lot of different things, but one common practice is some kind of like aggregation and some kind of throwing out of rare things. And so, for example, one might just aggregate up to like genus level, and then only keep the genera that are commonly occurring enough. And so, just various examples of what this looks like. So, like in Annals of Applied Statistics paper, they started with about 3,000 of these microbe types. And so then they did that aggregation to the genus level, which gave them about almost 90 genera. But they found that that was still actually there was a lot of rarity. So basically they removed about half of those. And so it's a very big reduction if you're looking at it, like from 3,000 features, this really high resolution thing, down to maybe about 40. And it's done also in the Biostatistics Journal, also in ISME, which is like more of a domain-specific journal, where they talk about they had a 90% reduction in the number of these microbe types that were considered. And what I liked about this ISME paper is they kind of explain why they were throwing out all that stuff. They said, if there's too little variation among samples for a given microbe type, then fitting the statistical model will fail as there's no information. And intuitively that makes some sense, but that was sort of a good starting place for us just to kind of convince ourselves that this really was a problem and to understand it better. And to do that, we started by looking at kind of the simplest situation, or the statistician's favorite thing to think about, which is like least squares. And so what do we do? Well, we said, okay, let's imagine we have y that comes from this linear model, and we're going to let p be fixed. Obviously, like in high dimensional statistics, they love letting p grow to make it harder as n grows, but here we're going to supposedly have a very simple situation where fixed dimension n growing, and but what we'll do instead is we're going to say that one of the features, the jth feature, which is a binary vector, we'll say that it only has a finite number of ones. Okay, so even though n is going to infinity, this vector is not getting more events occurring. And in such a case, well, you don't have consistency of least squares, even though p is fixed. And even if you do something less severe than that, like if you could allow the number of ones to grow with n, still it would affect the rate of convergence, for example, of your ability to estimate this coefficient vector. Okay, so it's just to sort of see that, all right, yeah, this is a real problem. So what can we do? Well, as you can guess from how I started this, we're going to consider some amount of attempt to aggregate these rare features into less rare ones. And so the idea is like, well, if you have some sort of tree that organizes these very rare features together in some way, we could maybe think about aggregating, using the tree to aggregate. So for example, here would be breaking, what we started with a bunch of features. Now just think of it as really just only 4 features, where like in the yellow box, we would count any time any of these words occur, that would count as an event. And right. So that would be a way that now we have 4 relative, not as rare features involved that we could then think about using in regression. And probably you're wondering, which you should be, which is, well, but how do we get those 4? We could have drawn the boxes in many different ways. We could have zoomed, put in, 3 or 2 or 3 boxes instead of the 1 yellow one. And so that's the point. Like, we will provide a method for data adaptively deciding where to draw those boxes. And I also just want to, as we talked about at the start a bit, I want to make the point that actually these aggregated features, it's not just that oh, they're too rare and so they're too difficult to work with. It could actually be the case that aggregation is the proper thing to do. And just to get some sense of that, like, imagine your raw features, like on the left here, are counting how many times individual animal names were used in this document. And maybe our goal is to predict whether this is a document about agriculture or not. And so, it could be that it doesn't matter how many times the word chicken versus cow was used. Like, probably just matters, like, was it a farm animal or not? And so if we could somehow have access to this aggregated feature of, how many times is any farm animal mentioned versus how many times is any African animal mentioned, maybe those 2 features would actually be a useful way of telling whether this document is about agriculture or not. And so that's where we're going from a high resolution to a low resolution might actually be the right thing in terms of getting at the signal that's relevant. Of course, the reason we could tell that this might be the relevant thing is because we defined a specific prediction problem. And by no means would one expect that the same aggregation would be appropriate across different problems. It really depends, like, what is the goal of doing this aggregation. Okay, so so I'm going to move on then to the question of how do we do this aggregation. And in our case, it's based on a simple observation, which is that, so on the left here, we have a picture of a data matrix that is sparse because there are very few of those black squares. And so how can we aggregate this into, let's say, 3 features represented by the red, green, and blue? Well, basically the observation is just if you have coefficients that are set to be equal to each other, that's equivalent to using a new feature that is just the sum of the individual features. And so, like, you can see in the box that next, you can see directly why that's the case. And so so if only we could set certain coefficients equal to each other, that task, that making those equal is equivalent to deciding not to use the first 4 features individually, but instead using the aggregate feature. And so that's kind of going to be the trick that we're going to use in order to do this aggregation. Yeah, Tyler.
Here, if I understand correctly, there's kind of 2 things that are going on. One is that the features are sort of functionally equivalent, related to all the things, and that they're rare, which is why you add them together as opposed to say using one that is propagated. Is that fair?
So in this specific context, we've set it up that the x's represent counts of an event. So adding those kind of makes sense, right? Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and the functional equivalence part, I guess, just drops out of this idea that, if we think that we only care about how many times any of these animals were mentioned, well, that's equivalent to a statement of functional, equivalence. Exactly right. Yeah, that's a good way of saying it. Yeah. Okay, so actually, early on in this project, a seminar speaker came to Cornell, and my grad student met with him. I guess told him a little bit about this project, and he was skeptical that aggregating could actually make any big difference, and that led us to the following result, which was basically our way of showing that, yeah, no, actually, it was like getting a referee before we were ready to submit a paper. It was actually kind of useful, but So basically, what do we want to show here? We want to show that aggregating features can actually make a difference. And what we're going to say is that we're providing an example where if you try to do the lasso on the original features, you would be unable to get this perfect support recovery, right? Support recovery being like, can we tell which of the coefficients in truth is 0 or non-zero? And so basically we have this is the sort of the bad news. It says that there does not exist a value of lambda where we would get support recovery. And then the good news is saying if you could have like an oracle, an aggregation oracle that tells you, oh, these are the K groups. You have P features, but actually there are K groups, and this is what they are. And now you want to do the lasso on that problem. Well, then you can do well. And so we show that there's like a range of signal strength where both of these are true. Lasso fails, and this aggregation done by an oracle would do quite well. So that seems encouraging. So okay, great. I mean, at some level this seems obvious, but it was useful to actually see that this was true before we tried to then solve the problem of how to do aggregation, which we will not do as well as an oracle, of course. And I do like another thing that to think about is there is, some of you have already thought about the bias variance trade-off here. And so we can be explicit about that in the context of feature aggregation, which is to say that, even if there is no true aggregation structure, like this idea of equality constraints is probably a little too strong. Still, it might not be a bad idea to try to impose this structure if it's like, if the truth is not too far from the aggregated structure we have. And so here, this is a result about prediction error. And it's a very simple situation. It's imagining that suppose we started with a particular set of a particular partition of the features, and then we do the aggregation according to those groups, and then we fit least squares on these new aggregated features. And I'm not saying anything like this is just for an arbitrary partition of the features, which I'm calling like script C. And in such a situation, the prediction error could be better than if we didn't do any aggregation. And we see that there are these two terms. The first would be like the bias term. The second would be the variance term. And so the variance term, if we think about regular least squares, it would be unbiased. If we did least squares on all P features, be unbiased, but the variance term would be sigma squared P over N. So the idea is if we could aggregate to just size C groups, then our variance could be much smaller, sigma squared number of groups over N, which is great. And then the question is, how much bias do we incur? But basically what we see is as long as the coefficients within one of these groups are not varying too much, it might not be so bad. Let me just, Tyler already broke the ice, but are there any questions? Please feel free to ask if there are. Also, okay, so we end at 4:30, is that right? Yeah, okay, great.
Sorry, Jacob, maybe a clarifying question. Are you thinking about aggregating? So you showed this dendrogram. Are you thinking about aggregating by sort of, in a sense, cutting?
Phenomenal, and then one was like, okay, like those are both like kind of good words that maybe you would think intuitively want to put together somehow, but like one of them maybe has a bigger effect.
Yeah, that's a good point. So, I guess you could answer that from this standpoint, which is that putting them in the same group might be okay, even if they have different effects, as long as they're both kind of similar. I guess the problem is if you have two words that like would be similarly located on the tree for some reason, and yet maybe they have like really opposite effects, that's where it would be really bad to put them in the same group. And so to some degree, you would hope that the procedure that we will describe in a minute about how to draw the boxes would have those words in separate boxes then. That would be a case where it really is beneficial to zoom in. So yeah. Yeah, please.
Clarifying question. Are we always assuming that the tree structure is fixed in the
Yes, through all this, I will assume that the tree structure is fixed and known, which which is the obvious problem with this, which is if the tree is not good, then this is not a good thing to do. Though we will, I mean, it's a form of regularization, and you could choose not, like if you cross-validate, you could just see that, oh, regularizing using this tree is not a useful thing, and you could think about extensions of this where you have multiple trees that kind of compete with each other. Yeah.
The idea of having a fixed number of non-zeros, but then growing your sample size seems less intuitive to me than this fixing a proportion of your vector that has non-zeros. So could you comment on that choice of using values and types of things?
Yeah. So what I was trying to do is similar to what the high dimensional statistics thing, which is, we know that as n goes to infinity, everything becomes easy. So you need to make the problem progressively harder. And so in high dimensional statistics, the way they do that is they have p grow with n at a rate where you can see what the trade-off is between the two. And so I was trying to mimic the same thing. So if I did what you said, and I said, okay, we have the rare, the proportion of non-zeros is going to be fixed, and I let n go to infinity, then that's actually, you'll do perfectly, because the problem is like well behaved. And so just like you need to increase p with n, similarly I need the rarity to be going down to 0 as a function of n. And so I did that in a rather blunt way, which would give inconsistency, but I could make it dropping more slowly or less quickly. Yeah, more slowly, and then that would mess up the convergence rate, but it would maybe be consistent still. Yeah.
I don't know if I could.
Yeah. Yeah, right. It just occurred to me, maybe I should be repeating questions for Zoom. I don't know. Oh,
Actually, do you hear questions on the Zoom at all, or no?
oh, okay. Interesting. I don't have any volume control on here. Like, it's grayed out.
Let me see.
But let me answer this question first. Okay, sorry. So whatever, yeah. So when you see our method, we will have something that allows you to zero out individual features. And so I think that would address what you're saying, which is, what's that? I guess you could, I'll explain what the method is in a little bit, and then you can tell me if you think it's principled or not. But hi, Ali. I can't hear you.
I think Ali is going to have a question.
Okay, sorry about that.
Hi, sorry, I just typed it. I wasn't sure whether you could hear me or not.
Can you comment on how the aggregation is related to the smoothing out the tree? Yeah, can you comment on like how the aggregation is related to smoothing out the tree?
Yes, yeah. So I guess maybe I'm going to wait to answer that until I say what the method is. And you will see that it is a form of smoothing on a tree. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, sorry, Ali. Okay, so.
No worries at all.
All right, so what exactly is our method now that we've talked a lot about the general idea of it? So our approach is actually to, so remember, every feature can be thought of as a leaf of some tree. And our approach will be to actually add a bunch of kind of latent parameters at every node of the tree. And what we'll do is we'll think of each of the betas, each of the original coefficients, like on a particular word, as the sum of its ancestor of these latent parameters. So for example, like beta 2 would be gamma 2 plus gamma 6 plus gamma 8. Okay, and gamma and beta 1 likewise would be gamma 1 plus gamma 6 plus gamma 8. And so you could imagine we're going to have this matrix A, which is a binary matrix, and it basically just says, how do you add up the gammas to get to each beta. So the tree structure will be encoded in that matrix A. And then what we do is, well, okay, one more observation, which is that if gammas are 0, then that corresponds to betas being equal to each other, because think about beta 1 and beta 2. So gray means 0 here. So because gamma 1 and gamma 2 are both 0, beta 1 and beta 2 are both equal to gamma 6 plus gamma 8. Okay, and so basically what we've done is we've made it so that if you have sparsity in those gammas, that will help you tend to have betas equal to each other. And if we see subtrees where all the betas are equal to each other, as I said earlier, that corresponds to aggregating those features into these summed up features. So this particular solution here that we see corresponds to a case where you have effectively only 2 features. You have the first feature is the sum of the first 3 original features, and then the second new feature is the sum of the fourth and fifth. And so now, asking for parameters to be 0 is something we know well. Many approaches to doing that, and so in our case we use like a lasso style penalty weighted version. So what is our estimator? Well, we have sum of squared errors is the first part, and then we have this big penalty term, which I'll talk about in a minute, and then we have subject to the constraint that beta is equal to a gamma, and so that beta equals a gamma part, that's the part that encodes the tree structure, right? Because it says which betas are near each other, will share a lot of the gammas, for example. And then we have sort of 2 parts of the penalty. This first part will tend to encourage sparsity in gamma, which will have the effect of aggregating together betas. And then that second part is getting sparsity in the betas themselves, which may or may not be a principled approach to making it so you can zero out certain rare features on their own. And so actually to Ali's question, so this first term where we have the L1 norm or a weighted L1 norm on gammas, that is, I guess, a form of smoothing on a tree, I would suppose. In fact, there is a way of looking at this a little differently that corresponds to a sort of fused lasso using the tree, I believe. So, okay, so to solve, and we have this with 2 tuning parameters. There's lambda, which is just like how much regularization is there in total, and then there's alpha, which is saying what's the trade-off between wanting like not very many words selected versus how much aggregation do we want to have occurring. Yes. Right. So I think what you're saying is, suppose we just get rid of beta and just plug in, so we could have x times a times gamma there. And so then the new design matrix is x times a, which has a feature for every node of the tree. So far, yeah, exactly. So we could do that. In fact, we do that in some later work where we don't have this penalty anymore. But because of this penalty, the L1 penalty on the betas, that makes it, I guess, sort of a different problem. Yeah. Okay, so to solve this, we use ADMM, the alternating directions method of multipliers. And I'm just going to, for the purpose of this talk, I'm going to skip. In fact, I should start going much faster is what I'm realizing if I want to talk about things beyond regression. So it's good. That's fine. So we do talk a little bit about we try to say something on the theory side about this estimator. And to me, one of the more interesting aspects of this is rather than just dealing with, like in lasso theory, one often has like the active set, like the set of non-zero coefficients. Here we have a notion of like the aggregating, the proper aggregation. And the proper aggregation, the set B star, which basically says like what are the nodes you should aggregate on. That's a function not just of the true beta star, but it's also a function of the tree that you've handed the procedure. And so it could be like what is a good tree from this perspective? A good tree is one where actually you can, for the true beta star, you only need a small number of these aggregating nodes. But if you hand like the wrong tree to this problem, it's going to come out that you need a lot of, like all of these aggregating nodes have to be all the way at the bottom like they are here. And that's maybe just a property of like having chosen the wrong tree. Okay, so we have a prediction error result about this, which I'm going to essentially skip over. So we return to the TripAdvisor data. I can talk later if people are interested to hear about how we generated the tree. But basically what we show is if we compare our method to just doing the lasso or doing the lasso where you start by throwing out any features that are too rare, or where you aggregate to some level and then do the lasso. So we have sort of these baselines to compare to, and we can see some advantage of our method. I'm going purposely quickly here, but I'm happy to return later. You can see sort of at a qualitative level, in blue and red, you can see like positive and negative coefficients. So the lasso tends to give something that takes a small number of words, but what we'll find is they tend to be never the rare ones. And our method tends to give something where it's more like aggregating a lot of things together. And just to get a sense for that, like here's one subtree where there were heard, loud, yelled, shouted, screaming, crying, blaring, and banging, all words you don't want to see in a hotel review. And basically the lasso only chose heard and loud because these were the only words that were occurring commonly enough that it could actually infer something about them. And it zeroed out all the others. Whereas our method was able to basically borrow strength across that whole sub-branch. And which seems like, at least in this example, this cherry-picked example was the right thing to do. Okay, so then we moved on to try to apply this sort of thing to microbiome data. And this is with still Zhao Han, but also with my collaborator, Christian Mueller in Munich, and his student, Leo Simpson. And so, as I said earlier, right, so the traditional pre-processing might be something like the picture on the left, where you go to like the level of genus, let's say. And what we're aiming for is something more flexible, like on the right. And I'm actually going to just basically skip over the reasons why this problem was a little different and kind of interesting compared to what I said before. Again, I'm happy to return, but basically we could apply this and we get some sort of, like on a taxonomic tree, we can say like, okay, here are the, like sometimes you want to aggregate to phylum level, and in other places, like to a specific class. Okay, so now I'll go to a different problem, which is graphical modeling. And where we still have this aggregation question in mind. And this is work with my collaborator, Ines Wilms in the Netherlands. And our starting place for this was thinking about Gaussian graphical modeling, and in particular, the graphical lasso. And the idea here is if you imagine your data being these random vectors where you get to measure p features, and they come from a Gaussian, we're interested in the dependence structure among these variables, and we know that that it turns out sparsity, like if you know a particular entry of the inverse covariance matrix is 0, right? So here the covariance would be omega inverse. So if the jkth entry of omega is 0, that tells us something about the dependency structure. In particular, it says that if I could condition on all the variables except for j and k would be independent given all the others. And so it'd be nice if we could estimate this inverse covariance matrix to be sparse. And this has been done for a long time now. And the graphical lasso is one of the most popular methods for doing it. And it's basically you take the log likelihood and then you put an L1 penalty on this inverse covariance matrix, omega. Okay. So notice that all of this is focused on edges, right? We're talking about like a particular pair, j and k. And so we're picturing like we'd like a sparse graph. We'd like a lot of, most of the edges are not there, only a small number of edges. And that's the kind of simplicity that the graphical lasso is going for. It's not really thinking about the nodes. And so when we think about this question of resolution, if we just measured something at a really, really high resolution, should we still expect the edges to be sparse? There be a small number of edges. It seems like the resolution of like what the variables are should play an important role in thinking about that. And so just to think about it with a toy example, imagine we have p features where the first two features, x1 and x2, they're the sum of all the rest of the variables plus some noise. Okay, so the only reason x1 and x2 are different from each other. Oh, no, that's good. All right. The only reason they're different from each other is because of this, idiosyncratic noise. But other than that, they're just the sum of the remaining p minus 2 features. So the graphical lasso, remember, is trying to estimate the inverse covariance matrix as a sparse matrix. But actually, this is what the graph that it's trying to estimate would be, and it's not at all sparse. In fact, it only has one missing edge, the one between x1 and x2. What we'd really like to do in our heads, we know from this, looking at this example, we'd like to do something like this, where we'd say, actually, there are three things happening here. There's x1, x2, and then there's like the sum of all the previous features. And so this is what we could get if only we could aggregate variables first. It's actually a very simple situation here. But using the graphical lasso would be the wrong approach in this situation. Okay, so again, I'm going to go quickly and just sort of skip over the details. Like the approach we took was very similar to the regression setting, except now we're dealing with a matrix rather than just a vector. And so the optimization problem looks messier, but it's the same exact idea, which is we add this constraint that involves the tree structure through a binary matrix. And we can apply it, we apply it to different stock markets. And I'm sorry that this image is actually a little too light, but basically what I'm showing here is a tree where every leaf is a different stock market index. And the tree structure is based on geography. So like all the North American ones are in a branch, and there's a Canadian and then the US ones under it. And so we'll think about aggregating something about these. And when we do that, we get this sort of block structure to the inverse covariance matrix, which means that we could actually summarize what's happening very simply, which is we say, well, there's a small number of these groups of stock markets, like all the US ones were aggregated together, for example. And we could see, oh yeah, it's connected to Canada and two in Europe. And then there are a bunch of stock markets that are actually, we didn't estimate any dependence structure. And so, okay, so it's very interpretable. The question is, does it do better or not in terms of getting at the truth? And how do we do that? Well, one way to do it is with some notion of sort of like held out data. And so we can say, well, we're sort of an estimation problem here. We're trying to estimate a true covariance matrix or inverse covariance matrix. And so here we compare where we hold out some data and we say, okay, well, how, we'll say we have a test sample covariance matrix, and how close can we get based on the training data using different estimators. And here we compare the graphical lasso to ours. And we found that actually it seems like this is a more suitable structure for this data. Okay, and so then the third part of my talk, I think I'm not going to get to. But just to remind you, okay, so this is work of my student Sumeng Xiao and my colleague Adele Javanmard. And we do have the paper on archive if you're curious to look at it. And the idea is to do aggregation where we start at the top of a tree and we basically work our way down. At each point, we imagine we have a p-value that suggests whether you might want to split or keep it together. And the question is, can we do such a procedure in such a way that we control some notion of like the false discovery rate, but what we call the false split rate, which is to say like you don't want to be over splitting too much. And so I think I will leave it there because I just want to leave some time for questions, and I guess that leaves 6 minutes. So thank you very much.
Very good. Any questions? Oh yeah, we see a lot of it. So maybe you can also repeat a question.
Yeah, okay, I'll repeat it. Yeah. Giles, sure. Yeah.
So first of all, really cool. But you have this hierarchical structure coded in the tree. From what I can see from the way you set up the estimation problem, the tree hierarchy isn't reflected in the way you analyze the gammas, except maybe implicitly. Which means I'm thinking sort of I could zero out somewhere in the middle of the tree, and but then keep on
Yes.
non-zero gammas, and I'm wondering if there's benefits to including some sort of hierarchy.
Right. Okay, great. Thank you. So Giles is asking the following question, which is the penalty, like it's basically like on this slide. In fact, I conveniently for myself, I drew a situation where all the zeros were at the bottom of the tree, which described the exact structure I'm going for, where you're having subtrees equal to each other. But Giles is pointing out that an L1 penalty on the gammas doesn't stop you from actually zeroing out things high in the tree and not necessarily low in the tree. And he's asking, would it be beneficial to make sure that you always honor this sort of tree structure when you're zeroing things out? And yeah, that's a good point. And actually, our first formulation of this did exactly that. We used like a nested group lasso where we, basically if you want to penalize like gamma 6, you'd have to put it in a group with all of its descendants in there. And computationally, it's harder. And we, at least in our initial experiments, we didn't see enough of a gain to suggest that we really should do that. But it does go better with the story that I was telling. And it's also true what you say that sometimes we do get zeros higher up in the tree, which means that there are other kinds of structure being imposed through this penalty than specifically the aggregation structure or the specific aggregation structure that I was talking about. Like in particular, you could have like long range equalities that you might not really realize are happening there. So yeah, furthermore, like in some very recent work, I do have like a different approach in mind that I've been developing that would get specifically at the structure you're saying without using a nested group lasso penalty. Thanks, yeah. Yeah.
Efficiency gain from this method and down for you have, for example, in the general house example, like if we don't keep like good example for that, for example, if the real words are paired with a very specific word, and because we're sort of like we're doing the overall error. So could you have like a correct tree, but the aggregated sort of like in a funny way, but that all the clear words, pretty white, having words that they will that's it. Does it have any like guidance or?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's a really interesting question, which is like, you can think about different aggregation scenarios, like some where you have a branch with like a huge number of very rare words. But then you could think about situations like that branch I showed where you had heard and loud or something that were common words, and then the remaining ones were very rare. And it looked like those rare ones were being pulled in to basically match what the more common words were having. Yeah. And I guess I'm not sure if I have such a great answer to your question, except to say that definitely the tree structure will matter. And I think in practice, what I would suggest is if you have multiple trees in mind, you can try them and like cross-validate across multiple options. Actually, one really neat thing that happened in responding to a referee comment on the words example, I skipped over how we get the tree. We were using like word2vec, which is basically trained by other people on enormous data sets, like all of Wikipedia, for example. And those, every word gets, is embedded in a vector space, and then we ran hierarchical clustering in that vector space. And but a problem with this is like an example of like a bag of words model, right? Where we're not thinking about the relationship, like where the word occurs could have a big impact. And so we actually redid everything with like one of these models that actually takes context into account. So we used a model called like Elmo. And there actually you have like every time the word good appears in any review in the data set, it has its own vector. And so because good could also be like, if it's not good, then that's a very different occurrence than good, right? And so it's kind of involved what we did, but we got a tree out of the Elmo based stuff. Oh, this is a good system. And then using that tree, actually, we got much better performance across all methods. And our method was still the best, but all of them were greatly improved with a better tree. So.
I was curious, like, how do you come up with the tree? Like, I can see them out the I understand, so you have a file or any view, like, how it's done.
Yeah, so coming up with a tree is really important. It's so tempting. The thing we were thinking initially was like, it's tempting to say, why don't we just cluster like we have a data matrix. So just like see how correlated are the features and put correlated features together. In fact, that's something that we're doing in follow-up work, but in the rare feature problem, that doesn't really help because you're ending up with these vectors that are extremely sparse. And so your ability to estimate the relationships between them is not very good. So you get a pretty poor quality tree in that case. So that would be like, the hope would be you could do something self-contained where you're learning the tree based on just the data you have. But in my mind, like the most reasonable thing, like if you think about rare words, there's so little information you have about them. You've got to incorporate, I think you have to incorporate knowledge about words other than this hotel review data set. And it feels like that's actually the right thing to do, is to be using side information to try to allow yourself more information where you have so little. Okay.
So if your tree is in a rare word, as a word, is not appearing in the data set, cut off that part of the tree? Or does that not happen?
Okay, so I guess so we cut it down. I guess we subsetted to words that were appearing in the data set, I think.
To follow up, I guess my question is, you just drop a few samples from your data set, some words will probably not appear anymore, right?
Right.
So would you expect someone ethnicity and how you group like over the sample size?
Oh, yeah. That's a good question. So I think because also this sort of came up also when we wanted to apply it to a test set that has a word that wasn't in the training. So actually, I think I guess we didn't do the subsetting thing. I think we started with all the words combined that appear anywhere, and then right. So the tree structure, I guess, is separate from what words appeared in the data set. And yeah, if they occur not at all, I guess they would get the shared coefficient of whatever their siblings are. So did I answer your question? Okay, yeah. No, so the gammas are not identifiable. The betas should be though. Yeah. So. Right. Okay, so if you have an entire subtree that where you didn't see anything, but you could always go higher in the tree where that's not the case anymore. And so I think they would just keep sharing their ancestors until it is. Yeah. And it would be a really bad feature. So that's why it's key that we use cross-validation to decide how much aggregation. And in such a case, I guess it would always be a good idea to go higher in the tree. All right. Thank you all. All right, thank you.